My name is Padmini Parthasarathy. I'm a senior program officer at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. And we're really fortunate to have our next speakers with us today. So you'll notice we have one speaker in person when we were supposed to have two. We are trying to patch him in on Zoom. And I think they're working on it back there. So Chris Hoene with the executive, oh, there he is. So we have Chris Hoene from the executive director of the California Budget and Policy Center. As you'll hear from Chris, the governor's revised budget just came out yesterday, and since his job is to do budget advocacy, he is in Sacramento today, but was gracious enough to join us by Zoom. And then in person, we have with us Conway Collis, who's the president and CEO of Grace. And so you're going to hear from each of them about their calls to action on some current and emerging policy issues in California. And then I'm going to pose a question or two to them after that. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. And I sincerely apologize for missing the opportunity to be with you all today at a great event that's so important. My apologies to the organizers who've put up with the sort of changing schedule as the governor's budget was released this week. There's a lot of news in the governor's budget, and it starts with a lot of additional revenues, even additional revenues beyond what were reported in January, as the state's economy has continued to do well overall. It's produced new revenues. There's about $8 billion more if you take what they close out from last year to what's in this year's budget to what they're proposing for next year. There's about $8 billion more than they had thought even in January. So the state's, relatively speaking, in very good fiscal times in terms of revenues coming in. And the governor's budget proposal essentially proposes to use those funds in three different ways. One is by paying down debts. So he has a set of proposals to pay down debts that are still remaining from the Great Recession, and those would clear the books on those, which is something both Governor Brown and Governor Newsom have been trying to do. He would put a significant amount of funding into reserves. So the state's official rainy day fund, which voters passed in 2014, would grow to $16.5 billion by the end of the next fiscal year. And there's a series of other rainy day funds that are part of the state's general fund. And if you add those in, the total dollars that would end up being set aside by the end of next year would be over $19 billion. And that's on a budget that's just under $150 billion. So it's a fairly significant percentage of the total. So paying down debts and putting dollars away for a rainy day is a key part of the governor's approach to the state being more fiscally resilient going forward. But there are also a whole set of proposals that are trying to make some progress in terms of the state's vital programs. And there's a whole array of expansions in the arena that you might call economic security for children and families. And the first big news there is that the governor is proposing an even more significant expansion of the state's earned income tax credit than he did in January. So the state's earned income tax credit is a tax credit for low-income working households where you get a tax refund if you don't make enough income to actually have to pay your taxes. And it's a significant way of providing cash assistance to people. The governor is proposing several expansions. One is to provide a $1,000 credit to all households who have at least one child in the household. And in January, that was he was proposing that to be a $500 credit. So he's doubling that. In January, he proposed to increase the credit to keep up with the state's minimum wage so that people, as they make more money on the minimum wage, aren't losing their earned income tax credit refund. He continues to do that, and he's providing larger credits to individuals who had received smaller credits in the past. He's also proposing to put a monthly payment plan in place over time. There's some planning that needs to go into building that. for the larger credit, folks who receive a larger credit who might want to receive it monthly or in some periodic fashion. The piece that it doesn't include that advocates and legislators have been pushing for is to provide the credit to folks who are ITIN filers who have a federal tax number for the sake of working but are not documented. And he's proposing, he did not propose to expand it to that community, and advocates and legislators will be pushing that pretty hard in the weeks ahead. In total, the cost of the EITC expansion is over $1 billion, and a key issue to watch there is that the governor is proposing to pay for the EITC expansion by making a series of changes to the state's tax code that are changes we can make because of the federal tax bill that passed in 2017. So there are some exemptions and credits for corporations and wealthy households that the state can choose to align with the federal government or not align. And the way we do that could put some revenues on the table, and that's how the governor's proposing to do it. The kicker there is that it takes a 2/3 vote of the state legislature to pass that kind of change, those kinds of changes. So the EITC expansion, in the governor's eyes, hinges on the legislature coming along on his wanting them to take this 2/3 vote. There's a series of other proposals that help people in terms of children and families and their economic security. There's an expansion of Cal grants to get them up to 50% of the federal poverty line. There's a 2-week expansion of paid family leave for 2 parents in a household, so it amounts to a month if they allot it out that way. That's the first part of the governor is trying to move paid family leave from 12 weeks to 6 months over the next several years. There continues to be additional funding for child care infrastructure, for facilities, improvements, and workforce development. There's also some new dollars in the May revision to add child care services for school-age children that would come from the cannabis tax fund. And there is a set of pilot programs to produce child savings accounts for the first time at the state level, about $50 million there that will be administered by the State Student Aid Commission. Also in the economic security space, there's a set of proposals around housing and homelessness. The key piece there is that there's some additional funding for homeless support for local jurisdictions, and a whole set of ways that that's allotted to larger, more urban communities, but there's also some additional funds for a variety of other communities. In the housing space, the governor is providing some additional funding, but as he had signaled in January, he's sticking to proposals to tie that funding to jurisdictions providing their share of planning and building of affordable housing. And there's a lot of detail to go in there that we don't really have time for, but housing and homelessness pieces remain a key piece of the governor's budget. On the healthcare front, there's also a series of proposals. So the governor's proposal, as it did in January, would expand the state's Medicaid system, what we call Medi-Cal, to provide healthcare coverage to low-income communities. He would expand that to undocumented adults ages 19 to 25. The legislature has been pushing him to expand that to all adults in that community, and they'll have a discussion about that in the coming weeks. It's largely an issue of the budget dollars available. The governor is also seeking to expand the subsidies in the state's market exchange for healthcare coverage for Covered California, expanding the subsidies to 200 to 600% of the federal poverty line. What that essentially means is providing the subsidies to people who currently are low income, but they're not low enough income at current to qualify for the subsidies. So it's sort of moving the threshold up a bit. There's also additional funding for home visiting programs and for the Black Infant Health Program that are part of the overall health package. There's a variety of proposals in the education arena. In the preschool arena, the news is a little less good than it was in January. The governor scaled back a little bit of the funding that he was going to provide for pre-K infrastructure facilities. It goes from being $750 million to $600 million, but those dollars are specifically going to be made available to those schools that are expanding from part day to full day kindergarten. The governor also is calling for 10,000 slots in the pre-K system. He had signaled that he wanted to move to 30,000 slots in January. His May proposal calls for the other 20,000 of those slots to be made available in the future if the funding is available. So it's sort of a in case of a downturn, kind of a change that he's put in place in May. In the K through 12 arena, the way that our system provides funding for public schools means that when we see increases in revenues, we see increases in K through 12 public schools because of our minimum funding guarantee in the Constitution. So there's a pretty significant expansion in funding for K through 12 schools. Part of that the governor has outlined in the May revision would actually go into a special reserve fund that was created as part of the rainy day fund that voters passed in 2014. And that's the first time that reserve fund would receive a deposit. So that's a new element in the budget. And there continues to be new funding in the higher education arena. The community colleges, the significant piece the governor proposed in January is using the Stage Promise program, which provides a free first year of community college, expanding that to a free second year. That continues to be in the governor's proposal, and there's also additional funding for the Stage Community College system. In the Cal State system and in the University of California system, there continues to be additional funding, just as there was in January, and that funding is tied to those systems not raising tuition. Both systems voted not to raise tuition in the last few months, so the January proposals match for the most part the May proposal, and there's some additional funding there in those proposals that also goes to providing various services in terms of support for immigrants as the state continues to weather challenges to its immigrant population through federal enforcement practices. So there's news in the higher education front that's mostly about the funding levels. In the criminal justice and juvenile justice worlds, the prison system receives some new funding that is largely devoted to substance abuse treatment and addressing opioid crisis issues in terms of the incarcerated population. There's also some additional dollars for healthcare workers connected to all of that. And more significantly, the juvenile justice system, which has been housed within the state's correction system, is being moved out, as the governor proposed in January, and moved over to the Health and Human Services Department, where it will become its own Department of Youth and Community Restoration. And the idea there is to connect youth who are in the juvenile justice system, which we have been unraveling and reducing because of practices that weren't working over the last decade or so, to take the remaining youth in those systems and connect them better to the types of health and human services that help them get out of that system and be able to thrive as they move out of the system as it's been previously structured. So that's the criminal and justice, juvenile justice side of things. There are a couple of missed opportunities as we are seeing it in the budget. One of those is, as I noted earlier, the I-10 filers within the earned income tax credit proposal. That's a community of folks who largely have a population of children who are citizens and who would benefit greatly from being able to receive the earned income tax credit. It's not a particularly expensive program, and so adding it into the overall package seems like a reasonable thing for the legislature to be pushing. A key piece that is missing in the budget that's an expensive piece is Governor Newsom is not proposing to extend something called the MCO tax, which is a tax on healthcare systems or managed care organizations, as they're called. This is a tax that provides about $1.5 billion to the general fund and has helped fund the expansion of healthcare coverage. The governor would need a 2/3 vote of the legislature and federal approval in order to extend the tax. And so the legislature and others are pushing him to extend the tax so that those dollars don't have to be made up elsewhere, but that's at current not in his proposal. And the last piece is that there isn't really funding in the governor's proposal for the SSI-SSP program, which is the program that provides public assistance to low-income seniors and people with disabilities. And this is a program that was cut severely during the Great Recession, has seen very little build back in the decades since, and continues to be largely left behind as the state's economy has improved. And so that's an area or a gap within the state budget. So that's the kind of big picture there. I just leave you with the sort of thing that I started with which is remember that the whole package itself, while there's a lot of attention to the program expansions that are there, has a lot of kind of fiscal resilience and cautionary measures built into it. like the rainy day fund investments and the reserve investments, like paying down liabilities. And one of the other key pieces overall is that some of these program expansions, some of which I mentioned here, actually have now in the May revision, where they didn't in January, they actually have some sunset dates over the next 2 to 3 years, where the governor is saying, well, we'll fund them for the next several years, but then we'll just see where we are economically and what the state's revenues look like. So there's another sort of buffer against a potential downturn that he's proposing in the budget. Well, I'll stop there. Thank you again for your patience with my not being there. I hope everyone could hear, and I will answer questions if the format permits, and otherwise you're welcome to send me an email or give me a call. We'll do what we can. Thank you.
A huge thank you for Chris for joining us by video, and I'm going to pass the mic on to Conway when you have it.
Good morning, and a huge thanks to Megan and Rise Together for bringing us together. Padmini, thank you for all you did in helping us coordinate before this. And Chris and I were in a meeting in Sacramento earlier this week, and I just want to note the kind of respect that the Budget Center has within state government in Sacramento. And in fact, one of the things I want to talk about is the work of the Lifting Children and Families Out of Poverty Task Force, where I served as co-chair, and it was set up under legislation that we sponsored. Sarah Kimberlin and Kristen Schumacher from the Budget Center were key researchers working for the task force. And as we talk about the comprehensive plan developed by the task force, it certainly is reflective of their work. So I'd just like to kind of remind everyone of a few things before we dive in. Can I just see a show of hands if, everyone has to admit it, how many of the folks in this room were born, say, before 1965? Go on, I'm one of them. Okay. So, I think that you can recall that one of the things that was really, prior to when we started talking about it, maybe in earlier 60s, it wasn't really possible to, for example, go to the moon. Prior to that, you recall, it wasn't possible for a plane to fly all the way across the Atlantic. 4-minute mile. That wasn't possible. An African-American president. That wasn't possible. I guess I have to say something perhaps less pleasant. Didn't seem possible to elect a pompous, ignorant, self-absorbed, anyway, you get the message. I don't know if there probably aren't any other Chicago White Sox fans in the room, but are there? I saw one, all right. We have one. So as growing up, it was never possible for the Chicago White Sox to win a pennant, but after 40 years, they did. So we have a long string of things that just didn't seem possible. We can go back to electricity, et cetera. And of course, they in fact weren't possible until they were done. I'm not a fan of Henry Ford's, but he did say one thing that I think was quite accurate. He said, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're probably right. And that's also the deal with child and family poverty in California. So I know I'm talking to a group that knows the statistics. Almost 2 million children, 1,950,000 in poverty in California. That's the highest number and highest percentage of any state in the United States. So any time that we feel in progressive California that we're pretty good and we're sure as hell a lot better than States like Georgia, where they just stole the election from the Democrat because Stacey Abrams did win that race. The fact is that they're better than we are in terms of addressing child and family poverty in the state. And of those almost 2 million children, 450,000 of them are in deep poverty. That means half of the federal poverty line, an average in the state of about $12,500 a year for a family of 4. I know that on special occasions, there are folks in this room for a family of 4 that can spend $400 or $500 on going out to a fancy dinner. So $12,500 a year for a family of 4. Put that in perspective a little bit. If those 450,000 children were in one place geographically, that would be the 8th largest city in California, bigger, for example, than Oakland. And here's the other thing, and I know a bit that I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just think it's important when we think about big numbers to put those in a context. And the context is each of us think about our own kids or our own grandchildren. These are individual kids with hopes and dreams and strengths and weaknesses. These are individual kids, 450,000 in California. So why is it in California that we've done a very good job maintaining the safety net in the state, or the statistics and number of people affected would be much, much higher. But what California has never done is actually reduce the number of children and the percentages of children and families in poverty in the state. It's gone up and down a bit with the economy, but it's essentially never changed. So it's about to change when we work together. But what has changed that now allow us to actually do something for real in this area? Well, the first thing, I think, is, frankly, Gavin Newsom's election. I think that he's a transformative governor in this area to begin to lead California to, in fact, be the Golden State, knowledgeable, sincere, committed. I think the second thing, and crucial, is that we've never had a comprehensive plan to attack child and family poverty in the state. We've always dealt with it in siloed issue by issue: health care, child care, early childhood education, foster care, juvenile justice, safety net. Each of these areas has tended to be dealt with on their own, as opposed to part of a comprehensive package that's coordinated and works together and is measured. And that's why the plan presented and provided by the Lifting Children and Families Out of Poverty Task Force is so crucial. For the first time, we have a plan, we have a roadmap to get from here to there. And under that plan, and this is crucial, under that plan, and the administration, I have to give them credit, they haven't put all of it in, but they've been tracking it, and they know where they are in regard to it. Under that plan, for those 450,000 children in California in deep poverty, we can eliminate, not reduce, eliminate deep child poverty in the state in 4 years, and I'll tell you how. And we can reduce overall child and family poverty by at least 50% over a time in the next 10 to 20 years. So the plan, let's just talk about it for a minute, includes health care, prenatal care, expanded Medi-Cal, home visiting programs, the whole package of early child measures from child care to early childhood education, workforce training, specific ways to address foster care and the juvenile justice system, paid family leave, which I want to talk more about, promised neighborhoods, housing, and the safety net programs, which include the expansion of CalWorks, of Earned Income Tax Credit, and the new targeted child tax credit, which is crucial and is not yet part of the governor's budget, but I believe will be when the legislature's finished. And so you put those things together, and that's the key. It's not one of them. It's not a couple of them. It's putting them together as a comprehensive whole. So let me just talk about two pieces of it that perhaps have generally not been focused on, I think, as much as they should. The first is paid family leave. So right now we have a situation where for people earning under $32,000 a year who are eligible for paid family leave, 30% of them are able to take it. 70% don't. And they don't because they can't afford it. They can't afford to take any cut. They can't afford a cut of 30% of their income in order to spend time with their newborn. And contrast that with people earning over $62,000 a year, because 78% of Californians earning over that amount are able to take advantage of paid family leave in the state. So obviously what's crucial is that we move the reimbursement for low-income Californians to 100% reimbursement for paid family leave, at least for the first 6 weeks, hopefully longer as we move on. And here's the deal about it. In terms of paying for it, which is crucial for all of these programs, there's enough money in the reserve, and the governor has already recommended reducing the reserve by 50%, which would still leave $2 to $3 billion in it. By doing that, there's no increase in any payments by any employees for the first 6 years of the plan, and there's only a 1% increase for 1 year over the first 10 years of providing that increase to 100%. So it's crucial, and I think we need to move towards it. And the second, and this is a new proposal, but it was developed by the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality and the Budget Center, especially Sarah Kimberlin had a key role in developing it. It is a new proposal, and it simply says, for those Californians who are living in deep poverty, under $12,500 a year, it simply looks at the poverty line for the particular county in which they live, and it looks at all of their sources of income, public and private, and they simply get a check on a monthly basis to just get them above the deep poverty line. And this is directed, think about it, this is a population in and out of homelessness. So by the way, we're paying a lot anyway. But in and out of homelessness, evictions, food insecurity, car problems, telephone contracts being cut off, insecure child care. These are folks who are generally not eligible for earned income tax credit. They're not eligible for CalWORKs because most of them simply aren't working, perhaps because of a disability, because of homelessness, because of lack of child care. And simply what this does is stabilize their lives so that they're able to move into the workforce and the children are able to go to school. So the studies show, and this is as part of the task force, the one thing that really surprised me, we got reams of research, as you can imagine, was the research on this issue of simply providing this kind of cash assistance, the short and long-term impact, short-term in terms of stabilizing lives, long-term in terms of moving people out of poverty was enormous. So the key on this is that we don't play it safe on this, that we take into account that government can't just take time in terms of implementing this. There are people who are in and out of homelessness tonight, and we need to address it. The third thing that's changed is that now 61 organizations have come together to support the comprehensive poverty plan. From across the board, healthcare, Children Now, Rise Together, everyone come together to support a comprehensive plan. So that is crucial. So the bottom line, when there's a crisis and disaster, people come together realizing that we're in it together. And we've got to realize 450,000 children in poverty in California is a crisis and is a disaster, and we have to come together in the same way. We have to come together to pass the whole plan, pass the plan. So let me ask you to do 3 things. First, sign up at EndChildPovertyCA, endchildpovertyca.org. Sign up to be active and help join the 61 organizations, 50,000 Californians who are working on this. The second is join our events. You see the logo? We have a May 17th to May 20th End Child Poverty California bus tour, starting in San Diego, LA, Pomona, Wheat Patch. We're going to Migrant Labor Camp, Fresno, Salinas, Oakland, ending in Sacramento. Join us. There'll be dozens of legislators and other of the statewide officials joining us. We'd really like you to join that. So I want you to finally, in terms of closing, this is a time for action. This isn't a time to sit back and think about, well, let's consider whether we do something next year or this year. This is a time to take action. So I want you each to do something right now. Pull out your telephones. Everyone pull out your phones before we end. Everyone pull out your phones. And I want you to log on to End Child Poverty CA, End Child Poverty CA, and sign up now. Let's get this done. Now, one final thing in closing. Everybody stand up. It's almost lunchtime. Everybody up. Come on. We're going to, this isn't to just sit back and think and have a nice day. We're going to start to take action. Now, I want them to hear you in Sacramento. I want everybody together now. Think about a high school pep rally. This is it. This isn't just sitting back. This is, we're going to get this done. Everyone together. Pass the plan. Pass the plan. Pass the plan. Everyone together. Pass the plan. Pass the plan. Pass the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Conway. That was a great way to increase the energy in the room. Can we get Chris back? Bear with us as we get Chris back. There he is. Great. So, so you heard from both Chris and Conway about the various policy proposals and budget issues that they are working on related to economic security in California. And so a question I want to pose to both of you is that, you know, our policy context will be shifting pretty rapidly over the next several weeks as the budget deliberations end. And in the meantime, the Assembly and Senate appropriations committees will have a really big role in determining whether these pending legislative proposals go forward, or some may become two-year bills to be considered next year. And also over the next several months and then next year or two, as we get into 2020, we will have another set of budget and legislative cycles and potentially several statewide ballot measures of interest related to economic security. So given all of these varied windows of opportunity, I think it would be great for us to hear from each of you about what you think the political feasibility and the timelines are for these policy proposals that are priorities for each of you and your organizations. Oh, I turned it off.
Thank you. I'll jump in. First, I think the climate has really changed. I do think with Governor Newsom and the legislature, I think it's been a sea change with Gavin Newsom, where I don't think it's any more an issue of trying to persuade anybody that it's the right thing to do or the reasons for it. I think it's much more an issue of what's the best way to implement? How should things work? How can things work together? And the other piece, and Chris mentioned this, I think, as part of the governor's proposal on expanding the earned income tax credit, I think all of us have to realize that paying for these things is something that also has to be part of what we pull together and advocate for. There is a big surplus now, but that's something. It's a reason the governor has had to do a lot of one-year funding and then limited multi-year funding. We still need to figure out a way to stabilize the tax structure in California. And that's why, by the way, the task force recommendations were staged over 10 years, so that the spending was held down in the first 2 years until 2020, at which point there's an opportunity to look at a range of ways to stabilize the tax system in California, including some obvious property tax measures that'll be on the ballot. The governor's proposed now that some of the, which are really just tax giveaways, be closed in order to fund DITC. I think it's critical that all of us, as advocating for the crucially necessary programs, also realize that we have to play a role in helping to enact the measures that are also going to stabilize the economy. And I think if we do that, I actually believe that the comprehensive plan proposed by the task force, I believe over the next 2 years, I expect virtually all of it to be passed.
Yeah, I'll jump in here as well if you all can hear me. I agree with Conway. I think one of the really important things to understand is that to do things that are ambitious and that would really make a difference, like ending child poverty, those things cost money, and we have to figure out ways to pay for them. The good part is that we actually have reasonable and viable ways to do that, but I think we as Californians and people who represent and work for organizations who want to see these kinds of changes have to really push forward in a very direct and concerted way to help state legislators understand, help the governor understand when needed, what it is that what it is we want to see happen. But, to use the EITC example, we didn't come into this year thinking there would be $1 billion plus expansion of the earned income tax credit. And so that's great that it's there. But the governor is being very adamant that he wants it tied to these closing of loopholes that are in the federal tax bill. And we all know who's in power in Sacramento, and all he's doing is asking a set of folks to take a vote that basically says that they want to fix some aspects of a Trump tax bill that they didn't like. That'll produce revenues for the state, and the state will give those revenues to low-income people in need. That seems like a pretty reasonable argument, but he's honestly having real trouble getting the message across in the state legislature. And a lot of it is reticence about wanting to have to address anything related to tax issues while the state's economy is good. Some of it's people's fear factor about the gas tax decision from a couple of years ago. And so there's a negotiation that's going to happen very quickly in the next couple of weeks where the case really needs to be made that there's an opportunity here to pay for a major expansion of something that's really good for Californians, and it also makes the tax code more fair, and that ought to be a pretty easy thing to do. More, kind of long term, I think one of the things to remember about the importance of the work that Conway and his colleagues have done is it's comprehensive, as he said at the beginning, and it has a 10-year plan to it. And so we have to think about this in budget and legislative cycles as something that we get pieces of it done year in, year out, because all of these elements work well together. The earned income tax credit works great with the targeted child tax credit. Those things really piggyback off of the minimum wage. They work great with paid family leave. If we're going to make California an affordable and successful place for people who are struggling to make ends meet now, we're going to have to move these sets of policies together over time. So I just encourage people not to think of all of it happening in a given budget or legislative cycle either. We've got a few years ahead of us of having some opportunity to make some strides.
Can I add one thing? I think it's important for us all to realize these aren't decisions somebody else is going to make. You know, one of the things that, if you go on our End Child Poverty website, you'll see an interview with the governor. And one of the things he emphasizes is the importance of public awareness, engagement, and support. And so this really is the kind of thing. I'm sorry, it's the reason I wanted everyone to chant at the, and if you don't agree, I'm going to make you do it again. It's that the involvement and engagement and all of us actually working for these things is actually something that can make the difference, including on something like just the common sense closing of tax giveaways that the governor has requested. We need to show those people in vulnerable districts that they can vote for something that's simply tax intelligence, and we're all going to be active. We're all going to be active in helping to be sure that there's communication in their districts, that what they've done makes sense. So I just want to, this isn't something where we should sit back. This is something where we all have to take action together.
Great, thank you both. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to see if we can maybe take one question from the audience. So if anyone has a question that they might want to ask, there you go, you're the winner. We're trying to get a mic to you.
Is that Richard? Come on up. Or come on down. It's great to meet you in person. Hi.
It's more of a comment on piggybacking on the last thing that Conway just said around this, we're all going to have to get involved in order to implement this plan or make it happen. I work at Mission Economic Development Agency in San Francisco's Mission District. We're traditionally a direct service provider, but we operate a promised neighborhood out there. We are now, because of this broad statewide campaign that's been put together, we're now pivoting and getting out of our comfort zone and actually going to join this bus tour that was up on the screen here, because we know that this is the time where big systemic changes are being decided on, and so we have to step out of our comfort zone. So we're gonna spend a weekend riding a bus all the way from Southern California up here to kind of amplify what we think are very good policy proposals that have been proven to work. So I just wanted to say, thank you for that.
Thank you. So we'll wrap up. So thank you so much to both Conway and Chris for joining us today. Can we give them a round of applause?